wrestling fans, it's time for the Voice of Wrestling right here on voiceofwrestling.net, prowrestling.com, and of course, Fight TV. I'm your host, Chris Cash, alongside Nick Paglino, and you know, some weeks you just don't have a lot to discuss, and this is kind of one of those weeks. So it's fitting, though, because several days ago we had the opportunity to interview one of the best guests I think you can get if you're in pro wrestling media. He has a vast array of stories to tell, a plethora of knowledge, and it's a lot of fun to talk to him because he's a guy that if you can get him talking, he'll spit a ton of fire, ton of truths, and just really tell you kind of what he thinks without any recourse or worries in the world. Talking about Eric Bischoff. He joins us, and because the interview was such a long, good, solid, quality interview, Nick and I just wanted to come on and talk kind of just about the main storyline that took place this week in WWE, and then we're gonna jump right into the interview with Eric Bischoff. It lasts roughly an hour, but I'm telling you, it's worth tuning into and checking out. Nick, how's your week been going?
Good week. Excited to hear from Eric Bischoff. He, of course, will have some thoughts on a wide array of topics, actually. Of course, one of them being Roman Reigns, the reaction that he's getting from fans, both live crowds and the fans who are sort of that vocal minority online, the internet wrestling fan versus sort of the casual fan reaction to Roman Reigns. And, of course, we're going to be talking a little bit about that before we bring Eric on with, of course, this tease that took place on Raw this week with Dean Ambrose potentially turning on the Shield and maybe even jumping ship and aligning himself with that heel team of Braun Strowman, Drew McIntyre, and Dolph Ziggler. And then, of course, the sort of counter tease that took place on the show with Seth Rollins and the Shield sort of retaliating with mind games of their own and trying to get Drew McIntyre to turn on his crew. So we'll talk about that, you and I, Chris, and then, of course, we'll hear from Eric Bischoff on Roman Reigns and his feelings on the Shield and what's going on right now on a bunch of topics.
So, yeah, we'll kind of do our main event and then our main event interview with Eric Bischoff. So let's get started. It's the main event here on The Voice of Wrestling. Chris Cash and Nick Paglino. And Nick, as we mentioned, there's been some the teases that kind of took place, and I think there's probably a couple of reasons WWE might have decided to do this. One, because there's been rumblings of a turn by Dean Ambrose. I don't think that that's something WWE necessarily wants to do right now, strictly because they're still needing to use the Shield to get Roman Reigns over to the best of their ability, and it doesn't work. As seen this week on Raw, the Shield comes out, opens the show, and as soon at first you got Dean Ambrose talking, fans are pretty much into that, and then as soon as you have Roman Reigns take the mic and start talking anything, the fans are booing him. They have to actually acknowledge it. It's laugh it off. They don't really acknowledge it just by their gestures. I wish they would acknowledge it more vocally, because that's really all the fans want out of it, is some sort of response. So give it to them, and they'd probably turn their tune, or at least, again, just make it just seems more awkward when you don't acknowledge it. But that's kind of beside the point. I think that the rumblings that's been going around, Nick, as far as the possibility of Dean Ambrose turning, let's go ahead and kind of put that to bed. Let's go ahead and acknowledge it through storyline, and let's tease it in that light. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Interestingly, though, they kind of throw in, like you said, that double tease of maybe Drew McIntyre having to kind of decide whether or not Dolph is using him or Braun Strowman is using him. My question kind of really is pretty simple as we dive into this conversation, and is it really just good fodder for the feud, for the faction versus faction feud that's going on, Nick? Or do you think there's some actual substance to this especially anytime soon, that either of them could actually turn, whether it's joining up with the other faction, which seems a little less likely than any other, alternative scenario. But either way, Nick, do you actually think this is something that could take place? And do you think it'll take place sometime soon? Or do you really just think it's kind of bringing it to the light because some people have obviously discussed it and there's really not a lot to see here?
I think it really is a combination of both. And I think that's why I liked it last night. On the one hand, it works in the faction versus faction feud because it makes all the sense in the world for the heel team to try to get into the mind and get into the head of the other team. I mean, that's just simple, one guy trying to psych out his opponent, right? I love the fact that they are taking an intelligent approach with both the heel team and the babyface team. A lot of times in WWE, you'll see real ignorant baby faces. They'll let their guard down. They'll fall for things. The same thing can sometimes be said about the way WWE treats the heels. So I like this idea that they're going to say, all right, let's go out there and try to get into the head of the Shield and Dean Ambrose specifically. Let's target him and see if we can, as much as we can, talk about this inevitable implosion and see if we can get it to happen on our terms.
Right.
So it's just good strategy in terms of the storytelling for the feud. But I think the other thing that it does is it plants that seed for WWE to eventually act out on it. So, just this week it was reported by Dave Meltzer that, original plans, and I thought this was interesting, in light of what we saw on Raw this week, original plans for WrestleMania 34 did call for Dean Ambrose to face Seth Rollins one-on-one, with the idea being that Dean Ambrose at some point leading up to WrestleMania was going to turn on Seth Rollins and turn on the Shield. But of course, Ambrose then suffered his injury. He had to get surgery. He was sidelined, so that never happened. So this is a great way for WWE to also plant that seed for something that then can happen down the line. If they were going to do it at some point earlier this year, it stands to reason they might want to do it again. As far as when it will happen, I agree with you. I don't think it's, or I don't know, maybe you didn't offer this as an opinion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. If you agree it's not going to happen anytime soon, that's what I would think is going to be the case. Maybe not even at any point for the remainder of this year.
Right.
But it is a really good thing to start to plant the seeds for. And we talked about this before with Drew McIntyre. I think we both sort of felt like the idea here behind pairing him up with Dolph Ziggler initially and then adding Braun Strowman. This whole idea, I think, was to eventually build up Drew McIntyre as that main event player. So having Drew McIntyre be the guy who the Shield is targeting, having Dean Ambrose be the guy that the heels are targeting, I think it makes sense because that's the direction I would go in. If anyone's going to turn on anybody, those would be the guys that would do it. I think the fans have sort of maybe been anticipating or hoping for a Dean Ambrose heel turn. He looks the part at this point. So I think it fits in both good storytelling and to plant that seed. But yeah, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. If I had to guess, maybe it would take place sometime after the beginning of the year.
And I think that one of the other things, Nick, that, I don't like getting into comparisons very often, but, Dean Ambrose, from the time that he arrived on the scene in WWE, worked his way up, came to the main roster. There's been some Brian Pillman comparisons, but even now, I only say this not by how big of a star he can be or demeanor or any comparisons in physical attributes necessarily or anything like that, but maybe attitude somewhat of a Stone Cold Steve Austin. And I think the way WWE needs to play this, A, they need to be careful. But B, I think they need to, again, we've used this word many times as well, organically. We need to see this being, because Dean Ambrose, is very red hot. And personally, I think there's two people WWE kind of sees in this storyline within a storyline that's going on or that just started taking place this week on Raw. We'll see if it carries over beyond just 1 week. But I think one of the things, the two people they're trying to protect primarily is Drew McIntyre and Dean Ambrose. I think when they look at Roman, he's their guy. He's established. When they look at Braun, he's over. And they've taken at least a solid year to build him up to where he is now. And then I think a guy like Dolph Ziggler is just someone that again, I wish they would do more with long-term wise, but I don't think that's in the cards either. I think he's just kind of that really good guy to put out there and get others over at this point in his career. So I think that the two primary guys, and Seth Rollins as well, with his lengthy title run after he turned on the Shield, not to mention just that caveat alone makes it very difficult for him to turn again. I think Dean Ambrose and Drew McIntyre are kind of those guys that they feel need to be elevated. And let's not forget, Nick, Dean Ambrose has been red hot since he's returned. I mean, he is a guy that is getting over exceptionally well, and he's got this persona about him as if he could just not give a shit. He doesn't really care one way or the other. And that's the way you do build these Stone Cold Steve Austin type of characters, in that they can be a heel, but they're so cool and nonchalant about everything. They're somebody that people look up to, whether they're a heel or a baby face. And I feel like they need to do that. If they turn him heel, I'm afraid it's going to feel a little too forced, and it's going to be way too deja vu and reminiscent of Seth Rollins' turn. Not that Seth didn't go on and do good things, but in the end, Nick, I don't know that they're going to repeat that story again for those reasons listed, and just because personally, I don't think that he needs it. But Nick, I guess then I'll push it back to you and kind of ask if you believe, or if you agree with me on those terms, and that he doesn't necessarily need it. At some point, though, you do have to start looking at how do we start getting these guys back over individually. They're coming out, they're wearing the same things, and quite frankly, Nick, it's like, yes, it's good for Roman's sake, or this kind of faction versus faction thing that's going on. It's made for some interesting TV at least, and they're all playing their roles very, very well. But I can't imagine this is where Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose wants to be. Like, Drew and Dolph are probably having the time of their lives right now. Braun is in a very, very good spot. Seth is a big, big star. I mean, in his own mind, and I think the fans' mind, Dean Ambrose is on his way there, and yet they're latched on to Roman, whether they're friends or not in real life. I mean, again, they'd rather be off probably doing their own thing with their own personalities and their own storylines as opposed to having to be attached to this all the time. So do you think Dean Ambrose really needs this? And if you don't, at what point do you see kind of separate identities within the Shield? Because I feel like they need to go in that direction at some point with a guy like Dean Ambrose and a guy like Seth Rollins. And they haven't done that yet. When do you think that might start taking place?
Well, something that I would like to see is the idea of a faction. I think historically with factions in WWE, and I think you can even attribute this to tag teams as well. The New Day, they're a good example. There are guys who compete in the tag team division, but there's three of them. They're always together. And I don't understand why a faction always has to be together. Why can't you go several weeks with everyone doing a singles thing? Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins right now are singles title holders. There's no reason why they always have to appear together on television. The reason why is because WWE obviously feels that Roman Reigns needs it right now. You have to have Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose standing next to Roman Reigns so he doesn't get booed out of the building.
Right.
And I mean, that's, look, that's the whole reason why the Shield is together right now. So the only person that, and I don't necessarily feel like Roman Reigns needs to be with the Shield. I mean, as evidenced on Raw this week and in previous weeks, just because he's with the Shield doesn't really mean the crowd is accepting him that much more. They might, that actual crowd reaction might be a little bit better when Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose are standing in the ring and they're also cutting promos. But like you pointed out, as soon as Roman Reigns grabs that mic, they're crapping all over him like they always do. So absolutely, Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins do not need the Shield right now. So personally, I would like to see more of that idea of, week to week. Yeah, maybe they're going to compete as the Shield on one episode of the show or at a pay-per-view, but then you go a few weeks where they're doing their singles thing and they don't even appear together as the Shield. I don't necessarily know why factions always have to appear together. Again, they're doing it real specifically right now for Roman Reigns. So how I would like to see it maybe go down, and you know what, I totally agree with you, because as you were talking before, it kind of hit me that I don't think we need to see that traditional quote-unquote heel turn from Dean Ambrose. We don't need to see what Seth Rollins did where he smashes the rest of the Shield with chairs. We don't have to see Dean Ambrose quote-unquote turn on them. I think what needs to happen is, and I think that goes toward what we saw on Raw this week with WWE planting those seeds of him saying, hey, look, Roman Reigns is the top dog. He's the Universal Champion. Seth Rollins is the Intercontinental Champion. I want gold, and if we're not going to win tag team gold, then guess what? I'm coming after one of you. Right now, aside from the tag team titles, the two other singles belt holders in WWE happen to be in the Shield.
Right.
So Dean Ambrose can simply say, hey, you know what, guys? Shield or no Shield, it's my time to be Universal Champion. It's my time to be the Intercontinental Champion. I am coming, and I don't need to hit you when your back is turned. I don't need to quote unquote turn on you. I'm telling you, I came here in WWE to be a champion, and that's what I want to be. So it's happening sooner rather than later. I guess that would be a route I would like to see him take, and I really think that could kind of help push that, like you said, that Stone Cold Steve Austin type character where he says, look, this is not about friendship. I'm not your friend. You're not my friend. Yeah, we may have a brotherhood. If push comes to shove in the sense that you need someone to get your back, all right, I'm there for you in that sense. If we're in a tag match, if we're in a 6-man match, yeah, I'm going to play my part. I'm going to have your back. But make no mistake about it, I'm here to be champion. And so I'm coming after that gold. I'm not here to make friends. I'm not here to be anybody's friend. Right. And I am certainly not here to play second, or in this case, third fiddle to a Seth Rollins or a Roman Reigns. I'm coming after your gold. That would be an approach I'd love to see them take.
Yeah, and I think at some point it kind of depends on what happens with Roman Reigns, how long they want the title around him. That I think we're probably going to start seeing some of these things maybe start shifting and finally resulting in a turn of sorts, or at least different directions for the individual members of the Shield. I think obviously as the world kind of turns around Roman Reigns right now, especially as the champion. So we're kind of biding time until we see how long they're going to want that to take place, whether Braun's the guy to take it, Brock, which would be very, very kind of, I don't know, crazy at this point, I think. But we'll see. And I agree with you. I think that right now they're just kind of playing up stories that have already been circulating a little bit out there. Teasing these ideas and just giving some decent promo material, backstage material for their main storyline on Raw. I don't think it needs to be read into, although I'm with you in that it could be setting up some groundwork for down the line when they decide to go in that direction. I'm sure they've thought about it, considered it, and are probably still doing both of those things. But I don't think when they go into a Raw like this week and they tease it out in the open, like they did, I don't think that means to suggest they're already writing it down on when it's going to take place and where it's going to happen. I think it's more of yes, these are things that we've teased. It's also good promo material and stuff. But I don't think they have any definitive plan as it relates. And of course, things could change for any number of reasons before they actually pull the trigger. So we'll have to sit back and wait. A lot of you wondering and speculating, criticizing if that's what you choose to do about the way that the direction they went on Raw this week. But I really don't think it meant as much as some people are reading into it. So we will obviously follow that as we go throughout the weeks, but I am excited to end it here and excited to get our guest that we pre-recorded a few days ago on the show. He's been busy with his new podcast, The All In Weekend and StarCast, on our partner Fight TV's platform. It was a really very, very good weekend. Eric Bischoff was involved in like a Death of WCW panel, kind of round table type panel on a stage. It was interesting. Go check that out if you get the opportunity. And of course, 83 Weeks, the podcast with Eric Bischoff, is available everywhere that podcasts are. So make sure you check that out. He's going to talk about it with Nick and myself right now here on The Voice of Wrestling. All right, we are back on The Voice of Wrestling. Chris Cash, Nick Paglino, and we are joined by a very special guest, one that always makes for an entertaining conversation, an interview. Got a lot going on in his life right now that we're going to jump into here in just a few, but want to welcome Eric Bischoff to the show. He joins us by phone. Eric, thanks for joining us here on The Voice of Wrestling.
Happy to be here, gentlemen. Happy to be here.
Eric, we wanted to kind of jump into, obviously, your podcast. We know you were involved with StarCast Weekend, the All In Weekend, our partner as well in Fight TV. I know you've been doing a little bit with. They broadcast a lot of the events, most of the events actually, during All In Weekend. Got to watch a lot of that. So tell us a little bit just kind of about what's been going on with you, the podcast, how that's been going, and then maybe we'll jump into the All In Weekend and the StarCast stuff that took place just a few weeks ago.
Sure. Well, as is almost always the case and has been all my life, I seem to have a lot of irons in the fire. It's just, I guess, part of being an entrepreneur. I'm currently in Beverly Hills, and here for meetings on a couple of different projects that I have in development. In addition to that, obviously, we're doing the podcast. That's a big part of my week. I look forward to that every week and enjoy working with Conrad. The podcast has actually increased the number of live appearances I'm doing. I'm heading over to the UK the first part of October for about 6 or 8 days, doing some other events in November. Got a TED Talk coming up in Chicago as a result of the podcast.
Nice.
So while the podcast is great and it's very successful, I think we're number 2 only behind Bruce Pritchard, and we're probably the most downloaded show other than Bruce Pritchard out of all of the wrestling podcasts out there in the universe. So that says something.
Yes, it does.
And I credit a lot of that to Conrad Thompson and his team. Conrad's, he's found the magic formula, so to speak, for podcasts, and he's got a great team of people that work their asses off to, not only for my show, but for Bruce and for Tony and, the StarCast events. It's all the same group of people, and I just can't speak highly enough of them. Dave Silva, Dave Hancock, and others, but those are the ones that I deal with primarily. Just a great, great team of people.
Yeah, and I know now you're kind of getting, I assume, I don't know how involved you are, because I know Conrad, your co-host and producer and kind of the man with the plan behind the scenes, takes care of a lot of the technology side of things. I know you're very active on Twitter, though. Now that you've kind of entered, and I know you've gone back and forth, you've done a podcast in the past prior to this, but this is one that I think you're probably a lot more committed to, a lot more hopeful for as far as the future, going to be around considerably longer. What's it been like kind of interacting with the fans and stuff about the show? What's the response you guys are getting? The numbers from every account is great, but this is kind of the first time, I guess, maybe that you've really interacted in such a degree as far as putting your opinions out there, your stories, and getting immediate feedback from from the fans? What's that been like, and how are they receiving it?
Well, it's been really interesting, and I've always been fascinated with technology, particularly when it comes to communication. And I think it goes back to, when I was a really young kid growing up in Detroit. I had a neighbor, an adult neighbor, a friend of my family, my mom and dad actually, who had a Citizens Band radio in his work room. And this is going back now to the early 60s. We had a rotary phone on the wall. And by the way, in Detroit, where we lived, even though it was a major city, obviously, everybody in my neighborhood shared what they called a party line. So oftentimes during the day or early evening, you'd go and pick up the phone to use it, and somebody else was on the line that you shared with 8 or 10 other people.
Right.
So we're going back a ways, right? But our neighbor had the Citizens Band radio, and he was able to just simply turn it on, and then without dialing or anything, was able to communicate, to a variety of people. Some he knew, some he didn't, within about a 30 or 40 mile radius of where his house was. And I thought that was so, the ability to just, turn on this little box and pick up a microphone and have a communication with somebody without having to pick up a phone just amazed me as a little kid. And as I got older, coincidentally, I had another neighbor when I was about 14 or 15 years old in Minnesota that had a ham radio. And on that, which is a amateur radio, but a different frequency, and he was able to communicate with people all over the world. And I was fascinated with that. Now we fast forward to, social media.
Yeah.
And more importantly, even streaming. So now I can literally get on Twitch, which I do pretty regularly, or on Patreon, which I do regularly, and I can have live real-time conversations and video conversations with people all over the world. I go on Twitch, twitch.tv/83weeks, for those of you that are wondering. I go on Twitch, and I just, I call it, a wild hair kind of a show, because I just, in the spur of the moment, on impulse, I'll start streaming live, and I have fans from New Zealand, from South Africa, from Europe, all over the world, just jump on, and all of a sudden we're all talking about wrestling, and we're talking about the podcast that we just did. And I'm so fascinated with our ability to communicate worldwide now so easily and inexpensively. I'm just still, I guess since the time I was a little kid, I'm just fascinated by that capability and the technology that makes it all possible.
Well, and along those lines, now sort of delving into StarCast and everything we saw over that entire weekend, and then leading into All In, I mean, that was 100% technology driven. It was a groundswell that came from social media and putting videos out there and tweeting about it. And, this was not a television product that got itself over with the fans. This was really technology that sold this entire event. Were you fascinated by that when you saw all of that taking place over the weekend, and what was your reaction to that response from that weekend?
No, and I'm still even talking about it today. It's interesting. I'm here for a meeting with a major television network about not a wrestling property, by the way. So don't anybody jump to any crazy conclusion.
Right. Disclaimer.
I am not here talking to anybody about wrestling. I promise you. But obviously, what I've done in wrestling, comes up from time to time, and even in the meeting I was in yesterday, people outside of the wrestling business, and I'm talking about network people now, high-level network people who know about, what happened with StarCast, are amazed, and they ask me about it, and I said the same thing that you guys just did, setting up that question. 5 years ago, probably even 3 years ago, 36 months ago, if somebody would have said to me, do you think it's even possible for someone to stage a major independent wrestling event that would draw 10,000 people and do $1 million in pay-per-view revenue without television, cable or otherwise? I would have bet everything that I owned, that I'll ever own, or that I could pretend I owned, against it. Because the traditional wrestling model requires, and has since the beginning of television time, whether you go back to the 50s with wrestling on the Dumont Network, which was a loss leader item, almost like an infomercial that was used to promote the live events, or you go back to the early 60s when territory promoters like Vern Gagne, who I kind of grew up with, they basically produced their show and gave it to the network so that they could sell tickets in their local market, to cable television, which has driven, the WWE business model and the WCW business model when I was there. Those business models would have never existed without television as the backbone to promote the product, to get people interested in the characters and the story so that they'll buy a ticket in the local event or later on buy a pay-per-view. 3 years ago, I just couldn't have imagined that there was any way possible to circumvent that architecture from a business point of view. But, 3 or 4 years ago, nobody saw streaming being affordable. When
Right.
streaming first became available, it was very unpredictable. It was undependable.
Expensive. Yeah.
It was sketchy at best. It was extremely expensive because you had to buy, as a producer, you had to have a lot of bandwidth in order to have a shot at, delivering a signal that would end up where you wanted it to consistently without a lot of buffering and other issues. Now there are so many affordable, dependable, quality streaming opportunities out there, and we just saw it. We saw it with All In. That today, as you guys pointed out so clearly and correctly, you've got an opportunity now. Good promoters, good producers can stage successful live events without having to have television. And I think it's such an amazing time in the wrestling business. So I have to catch myself and step back and look at it from a distance, because what that says to me now is that much like, technology has affected so many other things in our lives, the old wrestling model of if you don't have television, you can't really be anything other than a small-time producer, those days are gone.
Yeah.
And now there's going to be, and what that means for guys like Cody and the Bucks and everybody that was involved with them and other people like them, is they're going to be able to find investment now that will enable them to do similar events. And as long as they can produce great events that have great quality matches with great talent and can energize the audience the way All In did, which, by the way, is not easy to do. That's
True.
Yeah. That's the other part. It's not just about money and access to the technology. You have to capture lightning in the bottle from a promotional point of view. That's always been the case. That will always be true. But if you can do that, you'll have the means now, technologically speaking, to be able to have a successful show without television. And I think that's really exciting.
A good segue here too is I'm kind of curious to on the WWE level. One of the big stories of the recent months that we reported on here was the massive TV rights deals that they landed with Fox and the likes. I think it estimated, Nick, what was the number, $2 billion or something?
Over $2 billion.
$2 billion
between the two networks.
Between the two networks in totality. And I'm curious, with you kind of the entrepreneur, of course, being the Vince McMahon, the closest to a Vince McMahon that we're ever going to have here on the show, most likely, to kind of decipher that for us, because one of the things that we've also recognized during this time, and I think technology and, of course, their over-the-top network, all of that stuff plays into it. But I'm kind of curious to how you would analyze that for us from a standpoint of the ratings. Used to be a huge measuring stick back when you were running WCW, and maybe they still are today. We're kind of curious to ask you about that, because the ratings are at an all-time low for WWE, but yet they're inking these massive deals. Is it the network? Is it technology and some other forms? Is it social media? What's your analyzation of that, and what do you kind of attribute that to?
Well, we could literally spend 2 hours talking about just this subject. It would probably bore most people. Have to get a little in the weeds. But I think the first thing people have to do is, as I say on 83 Weeks all the time, context is king. While the ratings, as you see them being published, now appear to be less than they used to be 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. During the height of the Monday Night Wars, for example. You got to remember two things. One is ratings they're kind of like voodoo anyway. They're a very inaccurate science, and there's a lot of duplication in those numbers back, during the Monday Night Wars. Without going into the methodology of how ratings are compiled, suffice it to say that if there was a combined 10 rating being published, like the WCW Nitro got a 5 and Raw got a 5, so people would sit at home and go, wow, there's a 10 rating in total. There was so much duplication in that number that it was really, really, really misleading.
Right.
So that's the first thing that I would caution people, about when they're analyzing what it was like then to what it is now. That's number one. Number two, if you look at how the television or the entertainment audience has been bifurcated over the years because of streaming, because of all the different platforms that are out there, because of the different ways that people get their entertainment, more people are watching entertainment on their phone now than ever before. People just don't watch television the way they used to watch television.
Good point. Right.
So the WWE ratings are, as you said, the lowest in history. Well, maybe not. It depends how you want to compare them. But if you compare WWE's ratings 52 weeks a year, on one show that's a 3-hour show and the other show that's a 2-hour show. So just, forget the names of the shows, but you got 5 hours of content that is consistently drawing a little over 3 million people an episode. Now, take me over to NBC or take me over to CBS or take me over to Fox and find another show other than sports that does that 50 weeks a year. And the answer is you won't find it. So you've got to compare apples to apples, decades to decades, and keep in mind that the audience for television in general, across the boards, I don't care if it's HBO, I don't care if it's Game of Thrones, nothing sustains itself the way it did 10 or 15 years ago. Those numbers will never reoccur because there's too many other ways for people to entertain themselves.
That's a good point.
So you've got to adjust to the reality of our culture as it is today in technology. That's number two. Here's the last point that I think is even more important than the previous two. What the WWE has done so phenomenally well over the decades, they invested in WWE.com way before anybody else was really investing in .com from an entertainment point of view. They and other people were. I'm not saying they were the first ones, but they really saw, the value of owning your database, owning your customers, having a relationship digitally with your customers. And wrestling fans are very loyal, so they're easy to engage with if you have a vehicle to engage with them. And WWE early on, going back to 1998, I believe, is when I first started hearing about it, really stepped forward and saw the future and invested, number one. Number two, they did the same thing with the over-the-top network. 5 years ago or whenever it was, when WWE announced that they were going to invest massive amounts of money in their streaming platform, everybody, probably you guys included, thought they were nuts, including me, by the way. I thought, oh, my God, that's insane. Why would you, their stock took a hit. There were a lot of analysts on Wall Street that were questioning, the veracity or the intelligence of making that kind of a move. Well, now all of a sudden, WWE not only has a massive, one of the largest digital platforms with WWE.com and database. Now they have one of the largest, most successful OTT platforms other than Netflix and Amazon.
Yeah.
So what WWE has is a massive, massive footprint of wrestling fans all over the world. And now all of a sudden, networks are paying a premium to have access to that database and those fans that the WWE has curated over the last 20 years. It's really a fascinating turn of events. In the past, producers like me or Vince or whoever, you were so reliant upon the network for their audience that they had you over a barrel in a negotiation. Now, if you've done a great job like this has, or the NFL or the NBA, If you've got your audience, now all of a sudden you have a whole different type of conversation, and you have a whole different valuation with these networks than you had 5 or 6 years ago. And that's what we're seeing.
And that's so interesting too, because you're talking about I like when you called it a footprint, and I feel like if you only had television, then your footprint was so much bigger because your product is being exposed through television. Where now, and even just kind of going back to the concept of All In or StarCast, or even what we're seeing now with this idea of all of these other promotions working together as opposed to really competing with each other. You're seeing all these different products now reaching the same audience. So the people who are watching WWE on television are also seeing the All-In product. They're seeing the StarCast product because they have access to the internet, because they're seeing it on Twitter, because they're seeing it on social media, because they're seeing it on platforms like Fight TV. So what do you see the future of the business shifting greatly, and how do you perceive this sort of idea now of collaboration versus competition? It was even reported not too long ago, I think within the past week, that Impact met with WWE at the headquarters. I mean, do you think the fan base is now just starting to see everything that's out there as opposed to just the televised product?
Well, clearly, more and more people, let's just look at All In as an example. Clearly, they took in over $1 million worth of pay-per-view revenue, drew nearly $500,000 at the gate. So clearly, probably all of those fans are likely, WWE fans as well, or viewers, to one degree or another. Some of them are probably very active and watch everything every week. Some of them may only watch once in a while. But I can assure you, all of those wrestling fans, there's a lot of duplication there. So yes, WWE fans who up until the last couple of years would either watch WWE or occasionally, a couple dozen of them would watch Impact when it was on Spike. Now there's less than a dozen. It's like 4 guys sharing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and watching it. But right. now with streaming and the various platforms and Ring of Honor and other people doing bigger things, New Japan Pro Wrestling doing some pretty big things, all of a sudden now the general wrestling audience has a choice that they didn't have a couple of years ago. As for the cooperation with all of the other, the different organizations, who knows? I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. If I did, I'd be in Vegas right now and not sitting here in Beverly Hills talking to you guys because I'd be playing the table. But, who knows? I think it'll, when it shakes out like it always does, those who have a great idea and a great vision and the resources and the commitment to execute it will come out on top. Those who are just trying to tag along for a free ride will fall by the wayside. And we'll be left with, a handful of really good promoters and producers who are providing a great alternative to the retail kind of big box version of sports entertainment that comes out of WWE. And that's not a criticism, by the way. I think people, I think All In, I think Cody, I think the success of the independent scene in general, let's put it that way, the success of the independent wrestling scene and the growth of it in general is a testament to the growth of WWE. There's just more people that are wrestling fans. Now, the good news for independent promoters is that the audience has now gotten so big and they've got such a strong passion for the product that if you introduce a great alternative, people are going to check it out. Because the WWE, there's a sameness to it. And there has to be, by the way. That's not a criticism. The WWE is appealing to the largest audience it possibly can. And above all else, they've got to satisfy advertisers. Advertisers are looking for a younger audience, and they're looking for a diverse audience. They're looking for men and women. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, during the Monday Night Wars, the televised audience was about 70 or 80% men and 20% women. Maybe not quite that high. Probably about 65 or 70% men, probably 35% women. Now it's almost 50-50. That's really important because advertisers value two things above all else: youth and a female demographic, because females generally make most of the buying decisions.
Yep.
So that's who they target. That's why they're harder to find. That's why they're more expensive. And now that you see WWE making such a big investment into broadening their audience the way they do, yes, your hardcore wrestling fans will say, God, I wish it would go back to the, they call it the attitude area. I call it the natitude area because it was nititude area because it was really Nitro that did it first. But, people want to go back to that, kind of, R-rated, more
right, edgy,
content. But guess what? Advertisers won't have anything to do with it. And if the advertisers won't have anything to do with it, networks won't have anything to do with it. And if the networks don't have anything to do with it, it won't exist. So they're doing what they have to do, but they're broadening the audience and they're making it possible for guys like Cody and the Bucks and others to find their niche. And I think it's great. Everybody's winning.
So on the business side, we've kind of talked about the All-Ins, the Cody Rhodes, and what they've got going on. Obviously, Vince and some of the shifts that's taken place in recent years due to technology and everything. Let's talk a little bit about the fans, and I really wanted to ask you about this, Eric, because I think it's been probably 7-8 years now when I was actually the senior editor over at WrestleZone.com. I remember bringing you on because a statement or something along those lines that you had made kind of made the rounds of the dirt sheets, and we reported on it. I remember bringing you on to talk about the quote-unquote 10%ers. And now that you're kind of in this digital world with us, very, very hardcore and very engulfed in it with your podcast, 83 Weeks, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a few as well. Talk a little bit about maybe how the fans in your mind have shifted, if they have at all, in your opinion, because to me, I've seen somewhat maybe a kind of a narrowing of the gap from what you might have once considered internet wrestling fans, for example, or versus quote-unquote casual fans. And I'm curious, with someone that's always been very outspoken about your opinions on the 10%ers or the very vocal fans, to me it seems like the casual fans are certainly more vocal than they used to be, and that can be attributed to things like social media and just the speed that information reaches them these days. So with you now kind of being in the middle of all of that, I'm just kind of curious on the fan side of things, the fandom, what shifts have you seen, or is it not really that relevant in your mind?
No, it's relevant, but it's a really good question, and I haven't thought about it from that perspective until just now, and I'm not sure I can do it justice with my answer,
right.
But I'm just going to react to it, viscerally. I don't think the scale has changed. Clearly, there are far more fans now by virtue of the fact that there's more information. It's promoted more heavily. Social media is promoted on WWE. WWE wrestlers are, active, probably 12 hours. When they're not working, they're probably, managing their social media accounts. So there's a far more engagement in social media, obviously, than there ever has been. And that certainly has created a different level of engagement, even with casual fans that 10 years ago probably wouldn't have read a dirt sheet because they wouldn't have been encouraged to. WWE wasn't encouraging people to go to WrestleZone or to, go to Wade Keller's site or anybody else's, right?
Right.
Whereas now, WWE and talent, that aren't WWE talent really are learning how to use social media. Well, that encourages casual fans to engage at a different level than they used to. At the end of the equation, though, I still think from a psychology point of view, you're always going to have the smaller percentage of people that engage either in watching the television show or the pay-per-views or engaging in social media. It's always going to be the smallest percentage that make the most noise because they want the attention. And that's just human nature. And by the way, It's true in baseball, it's true in NFL, it's true in NASCAR. It's true in
politics,
the gaming industry.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to be the expert. Everybody wants to have, news and politics. It's always the same thing. it's always the smallest percentage of the audience that makes the most amount of noise because they're trying to influence other people.
Right.
I don't think the dynamic of that psychology has changed, but I do think the scope and the size of the people engaged in social media obviously has. My point is, I bet you there are people now who listen to the haters, regardless of what someone hates, because they're always going to hate.
Well, you can't. Yeah, you can't avoid them like you used to be able to. I mean, you just can't.
It's everywhere.
But I do think that the average person is starting to recognize haters for what they are.
True.
And they're not as influenced as people think they are. Now, I think there are some instances where we see it manifest a little differently. For example, people have figured out, when you're on live television, you can do the opposite of what the writers and the producers want you to do and kind of become the star of the show and take over a show, if you will, by reacting the opposite of what everybody knows they want you to react to or how they want you to react. That's unfortunate because I think it throws everybody off and it affects the quality of the show to the people that are watching it and the talent that are in the ring. But, that's the nature of live television. They've figured it out.
Right.
The audience sometimes feels empowered to just kind of take over a show, and it's fun for them. And they do it, and it's unfortunate. But beyond those isolated incidents when that happens, I don't think it really matters. To be clear, I just don't really think it does. It won't generally change the direction of anything.
Well, but so on that line, because we've asked everyone we have on the show, we always bring this up, and I always feel compelled to bring it up. This idea of if you're reading the internet and you're looking at things, especially, and I think All In made this sort of maybe just brought this to the surface a little bit more, maybe shed a little bit more light on this idea of, okay, you watch an All In and you have droves of fans saying, this is a show that is reacting to what the quote unquote the fans want. And WWE is not giving the fans quote unquote what they want, because here we go every week we see a Roman Reigns. And so this is what, Chris and I discuss this on the show all the time. We call it sort of the problem of Roman Reigns, even though there isn't one. He's the highest merchandise mover in the entire company, but he comes out, he's getting booed, and generally, it's typically a very poor reaction from that live crowd. And that's maybe what makes some of us think, okay, that gap between the vocal fan and the casual fan is starting to narrow, because now you've got these mainstream casual fans on television that are rejecting this top guy. And so it leads fans to say, well, WWE doesn't listen to its audience. It doesn't give the fans what they want. Whereas an All In or a New Japan or a Ring of Honor, they're listening to the fans. They're giving the fans what they want. How do you react to that general opinion?
Well, it is very general. And, and I'm going to do my best to kind of rephrase what you said. So if someone who was looking at this business made the statement, well, the WWE doesn't really give the fans in general what the fans in general want. And then at the same time, they say, yeah, but I know that Roman Reigns sells more merchandise than anybody in the company. And they kind of put that off to the side, like it really
exactly. Well, you would think that it cancels itself out, right? But yet there's still that idea there.
But let me finish the thought. There's a real dichotomy in psychology there, or in logic, I should say. So in one sense, we're saying WWE doesn't really give the fans what they want, but this guy is the most popular character on the WWE roster.
Right.
So you got to go, wait a minute, something's wrong with the equation. And maybe what's wrong with the math in that equation and the logic is that the audience has been conditioned, whether they like Roman Reigns or not, to try to take over the show and be the star of the show.
Okay.
You can't say to me Roman Reigns sells more merchandise than anybody else in the company, but WWE's not giving the fans what they want.
Right.
What? That doesn't make any sense to me. That's like me going to a restaurant and saying, God, I'm so angry. I can never get a reservation in this restaurant. The line is always 3 miles long. I've been wanting to eat here for 6 months and I can't get a table. And then going, well, but they serve lousy food anyway.
Yeah, well, that's Yogi. That's Yogi Berra's line. Like, oh, that restaurant, yeah, nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded.
Yeah, I mean, there's a problem. There's a disconnect in there somewhere, and I think the disconnect is kind of the way the audience has been conditioned to take over the show on live TV.
Right.
They're just doing what they're doing to entertain themselves. And I don't think it's 100% of a reflection, at least not in general. Now, you may have hardcore fans, that 10%, that think they know better and they're smarter and they could book it better, or they could be better writers, or they could be whatever, right? You're always going to have those people. Again, whether it's the NFL, NBA, NASCAR, whatever people are passionate about, you're always going to have a core group of people that think they know better than everybody else. And that's just human nature. And those people are always going to exist. But I don't think the reaction that you're getting from the general audience, whether they're going against the grain when Roman Reigns comes out or not, are really reflective of what the mass audience that are watching on television feel.
Yeah.
I really don't.
So in your opinion then, does WWE need to, because this is another, this is what we always read, this is what we always hear. So WWE's got to do something about this. Do they need to do anything about the fact?
Wait a minute. Again, because we're all so close to it, right? And we dig it. We love the business and we talk about it. I do a podcast and you guys do a podcast or a radio show or whatever. But if you step back for a minute and go, wait a minute. We started this interview out talking about how WWE just got $2 billion for their
exactly. Right.
For their television. And now we're having a conversation about, well, the fans think that WWE's got to do something differently. I'm sorry. I don't think that they do. And I can give you $2 billion reason, $2 billion
yeah, no kidding. Right. Right.
It's working, guys. It's working. Now, it may not be what 100% of the audience digs, but you're never going to satisfy 100% of the audience anyway.
No.
With anything.
Sure.
And that's where this is where everybody should just take a step back, send a nice little email to WWE.com and thank them for growing the business, because it's because of the fact that the business has gotten so big and it's created an appetite for something different that has allowed people like Cody and the Bucks and others to have an alternative product that people want to see. Now there's a place for those 10% or 5% or 20%, whatever the percentage is. Nobody knows. It's a smaller percentage. But now there's something else for them. And WWE has helped create that demand.
I want, before we wrap up, Eric, I'm kind of curious, and I want to kind of touch and tread very lightly in the subject, because I know we've discussed it in the past, and I know you've said your piece a number of times about certain things. But one of the things that kind of popped back into my head of why I wanted to bring this up, I mean, it's a couple of different things, but at the StarCast events, you had the Death of WCW panel, you, R.D. Reynolds, Kevin Sullivan, it seemed like maybe Dave Pinzer or someone else on there. And of course, I don't want to bring and rehash the Death of WCW, but Nick and I've been doing this now off and on, I guess, in the last decade, a little more than when I first started. But I started my show and my hurrah journey into the internet wrestling community and quote unquote wrestling media, if you can even kind of call it that, when I was 17. And of course, 16 years later now, I'm still doing it in different ways on different forums, but I know you've been one of the most outspoken people, and at times very critical of the coverage of the business and everything. And I know you're a big political fan too, and so I'm kind of curious in this world of fake news and deciphering what's real and what's not. I think it's very appropriate to kind of talk about that in light of pro wrestling, with the social media being as prevalent and as dominant as it's ever been. Just kind of curious, what's your general statement or opinion at this point on, obviously R.D. Reynolds was kind of the top, was the guy there on stage, but the Dave Meltzers of the world and the fact that he's still kind of as relevant as he's ever been in the pro wrestling journalism space, if you can call it that, which I doubt you would specifically. I think I would maybe before you would, but I'm kind of curious, just your stance today. Has it changed at all? And why do you think that is, if it hasn't?
I think it has changed. It's changed a lot. Look, one of the reasons that I've been so vocal and continue to be from time to time about, I won't even call it wrestling media, dirt sheets.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk specifically about Dave Meltzer. Keep in mind that when I do my podcasts, we're covering, the Monday Night Wars. We're covering a period from probably 1994 to about 2000, right? That's the majority of the subject matter on our podcast. And when Conrad uses Dave Meltzer and quotes or things that he had written during that period of time, I have to react to it.
Right.
And much of what Dave wrote back then, we were talking about 25 years ago now, was oftentimes his formula was to do a good job, to his credit, of curating facts, attendance figures, ratings, ticket sales from arenas, things like that. And by the way, that information was available to anybody that wanted to do the work to get it.
Right.
It just wasn't readily available to your average fan that didn't know how to find it. Right. But to Dave's credits, he would use credible, real information that would give him credibility. But what Dave would often do is rely on stooges that use him, quite honestly. And I've talked to guys who've done it.
Yeah.
People would oftentimes, spread information to Dave that they knew Dave would report as fact,
right,
that would either further an individual's agenda,
yep,
or sometimes people do it just to screw with him and screw with other people.
Yeah, we've had that too. We've had that too, yeah.
We see these bizarre, and the one that I do, and I do it, I did it as mostly a joke, but it ended up being even funnier than I intended, is when Dave Meltzer reported a week before Hulk Hogan turned heel in 1996, Dave reported in the Observer, this is one of the things that Conrad brought up to me and asked me to react to, that I had been discussing the possibility of bringing Mabel in as the third man with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. This is ludicrous. It's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard.
Right. And
it was so insanely unbelievable that I made a big joke out of it, and we made T-shirts out of it, and I donated the money to Mabel's widow, Cassandra. But he did it, and he tried to cover himself by saying, well, I used Sean Waltman as a source. Well, Sean Waltman didn't even work for WCW during that time. So that's an example of the kind of nonsense. Right. Now, Dave didn't say, there's a rumor that Eric is talking about bringing Mabel in. He reported it as fact.
As fact, right.
He was using, so he'd use facts in real information, ticket sales, arena attendance, that type of thing. And then he would report on BS as fact. And the people that read his newsletter couldn't tell the difference between facts or opinion or rumor. He didn't differentiate himself, and he used a lot of really poor sources. He didn't confirm stories. He just printed garbage as fact. Now, in terms of where are we at today, I think that the world has changed a lot. I think that the fact that there's really only one major wrestling company makes that kind of access to stooges, whether they're feeding, ridiculous information or legitimate inside information. That information is a lot harder to get now.
Right.
Because I can tell you, I was there. I worked there in 2002, 2003, whatever year it was, when Vince McMahon held a meeting with, all hands on deck, production people, talent, office people, whatever. Catering people had to attend this meeting and read them the riot act about talking to dirt sheets. I was there. I saw it as an employee. So the problem has always had an adverse impact on the business. And I think the difference is now, when it was WCW and WWE, if you were in WWE and you were unhappy and you were disgruntled and you were willing to feed Dave Meltzer, inside information that would further your agenda or disrupt what WWE was doing because you were a disgruntled employee or whatever, or you just wanted to gain favor with some dirt sheet writer that would write nice things about you, hopefully, those days are gone. Because if you're an employee now, if you're a wrestler or you're an independent contractor and you're a wrestler, you run the risk of not having a job anywhere in the world
at all. Yeah.
You could go from making a very comfortable 6-figure salary in WWE to working on the independent scene for $45 a night and a bucket of chicken, if you decide you want to, leak information. So I think as a result of that, at least the stuff that I read, I read Wade Keller's site. Jason Powell, I've always read. I have a lot of respect for Jason Powell. I check in with WrestleZone occasionally. PW Insider I check in with occasionally, probably more than occasionally, probably every other day I'll check in with them. Because all of a sudden now, I've noticed over the last few years that people are writing, they're not spending as much time sharing their opinions or positioning rumor and innuendo, as Pritchard would say, as fact. They're just covering facts. And they're treating their product with a little bit more respect. And I find less and less of the silly Dave Meltzer, Mabel is the third man kind of nonsense now than did 20 years ago.
So you have gained at least a little bit of respect for him, though. Sorry, go ahead. I just kind of a follow up. You have gained a little more respect for the wrestling media as a whole overall.
Well, I mean, sure, you can say that, or I can say that. But you asked me, what's the difference? And I think the difference is, the wrestling media as a whole has evolved and matured and has conducted their business differently now than they did 20 years ago.
Right.
And as a result of that, I'm just not as offended by it as I used to be. I'm not as angered by it as I used to be. In fact, it's seldom now when I read anything. If I go to PW Insider, or if I go to Keller, or if I go to Jason Powell or WrestleZone, I don't read anything that really gives me any kind of real inside information. They're basically, curating news from other sources or news that's coming directly out of WWE.
Right.
As opposed to spending a lot of time editorializing about things that they think is true and positioning that opinion as fact. I don't see that as often as I
That's
used
a good
to.
point, right?
Well, do you attribute that to? I attribute a lot of that to some of it. I think it goes both ways. WWE and other companies are becoming more open with people like us now. There's that direct line of communication is there now, and it didn't used to exist. If you saw someone possibly get injured at a live event or something, and you were trying to confirm that several years ago, you'd get nothing. So it often left us in a difficult spot where we would get no communication from anyone on their end. So you had nothing but, going by what maybe someone else suggested or speculated or what they saw or what their, version of the story was. But now, you're seeing it with, Paul Levesque is doing an amazing job allowing us in, and he's hosting these conference calls, and we have direct lines of communication to their PR departments where we can confirm things. Do you think it's part of them being more malleable with us as well that's contributing to that?
Well, you would know that better than I do. You're but I would, based on what you just said, I would say, of course. Of course.
Right.
Because that was always the difficult part for us.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really fair observation and fact. But like I said, you would know that better than I do.
Eric, before we let you go, just kind of talk a little bit about your aspirations. You said I'm pretty sure we can now report as fact, exclusively reported here on VOW, that Eric Bischoff, I think you said you were in California, Beverly Hills, having a meeting specifically about the pro wrestling business. Is that what I heard? But no,
launching a new promotion. That's what it is.
I know, launching a new promotion. He's partnering with All In. He's going back to Impact. It was one of those. We're not sure, but no. In all respects, talk a little bit about your aspirations. I know 83 weeks. Talk a little bit about that and why people should go and listen to it, because I can attest and say that Eric didn't start just another pro wrestling personality or pro wrestler talking head podcast. It is very different. Conrad's every Conrad podcast has its own feel and uniqueness to it, but talk about yours specifically, and then of course what goals or aspirations as it does attain to the wrestling business, and maybe some other outside goals that you might have, and what you're working on these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, 83 weeks, the podcast is it's fun for me, and I'll continue doing it. And Conrad and I both talked about this when we decided to do it. Is we both agreed that as long as we have fun doing it every week, we'll continue to doing it. We'll continue doing it. As soon as it stops being fun,
Right, you'll stop.
We'll probably wrap it up.
Yeah.
And right now, I'm having a blast, and the reason I'm having a blast is because it's different than everybody else's podcast.
Yeah.
Bruce Pritchard has an amazing capacity to recall stories, right? And Bruce is, I've been in the business for 30 years ago that I broke into the business. Bruce has been in it longer than I have. Bruce spent a lot more time dealing with talent than I ever did. I was more involved on the business side of the wrestling business than on the talent side of the wrestling business. So Bruce has amazing stories, and he's funny as hell. He's got a great sense of humor. He's got great recall. He's a good storyteller. On the other hand, I'm not funny. I have very poor recall of old wrestling stories. And first of all, I wasn't on the road with a lot of guys. I don't have those, tell me a wrestling story. I don't have that library of experience, to draw from. But what I can do, probably differently than anybody else, or with more credibility than anybody else, is talk about the business of the wrestling business.
True. Yeah.
So while I do have, some stories that are relevant and, that were important to the Monday Night War era, for the most part, we talk about the business of the wrestling business. And that's what the majority of my fans that download our show really enjoy. And we can be funny. We have a good time. We pop off at each other, get a little heated with each other from time to time, and I know that's entertaining for people. I'll start laughing about it 2 or 3 days later, but, that always happens. But for the most part, our show is different because we talk about the business of the wrestling business, and there's nobody else that does it, quite honestly, not to brag. No brag, just fact. That's a T-shirt. There's nobody out there that can do it the way that I can do it, other than probably Vince McMahon.
Yep.
And I don't think he's going to be doing a podcast anytime soon.
Probably not.
Oh, wow. We'll see.
Hey, there was a story about some behind-the-scenes thing, though, right? Like isn't there some big behind-the-scenes deal that he's doing now? Not to get off
he's
topic.
doing a book.
A book.
They're doing a book.
Okay, cool. But hey, not a podcast though. That is true. Eric is the only one that can kind of give those types of that type of content. But sorry, Nick.
Well, and I think that, don't you think that's important? Because I mean, look, this is what we've just been talking about for the past hour. There are so many opinions I think people have that they don't take into consideration. I mean, I remember The Rock saying, when people were complaining that he was coming back and stealing a WrestleMania spot from someone. The guy's the biggest money maker in the world. He's one of the biggest draws in the world. It's show business. It's about, there's a business aspect of it that I think fans lose. They either don't know about it or they don't care about it because they're not the ones making the money off of it. So they sort of neglect to think about these things. So they would rather, WWE needs to change its model because Roman Reigns is getting booed every night, as opposed to dissecting the business reasons why. So, I mean, I think it's not only is it entertaining as a fan to listen to it when you're talking about it on your show, but I think it's really important because it's really helping fans to understand a side of what they watch every week that they're not privy to.
I hope so. I know for me, the more I understand something, the more I can enjoy it.
Right.
There's a fine line there. If I want to go to a David Blaine, Illusion show in Las Vegas, I'm going to spend $250 a ticket to sit in the front row and see an amazing magic act. I don't necessarily want to know how he does the tricks, but I am fascinated at the methodology and how the business is promoted and the pace of the show and the lighting and there's a lot of things I like to know about it. And I think the more wrestling fans can appreciate just how important the wrestling business is and be grateful for the things that it provides to them. The people that like to like I said, we talked about this. There's always going to be a certain amount of people that are going to complain about everything no matter what. But I think any wrestling fan right now that complains about the state of wrestling should just go find a shovel, dig a hole, and throw themselves in it. Just get it over with. Because wrestling right now is is more robust. There's more variety. There's more access to more diversified content than at any time in our history. And if you can't find a way to satisfy whatever it is you're looking for, then you're just a miserable person that is never going to be happy. So just give it up.
Amen to that. Last question, Eric. I'm going to
too much of that.
I know you talked about 83 weeks. I know you have other things going outside, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask the god-awful question of will you return and all that. So I'm going to ask it in a little different way. Which are you most likely to do first? All right. Since we've talked about all the opportunity in the wrestling business that social media and technology has created, if a massive investor came to Eric Bischoff and said, I want you to be the front man or the guy behind the scenes launching this new massive company that ultimately is going to go and recreate Monday Night Wars, because that's every fan's fantasies, or returning to WWE in the right role, which of the two do you think you'd be more inclined to do, or neither? You're just, that part of your career is 100% done.
It's really neither. I mean, and that's the short answer.
Right.
I could also say, if those two situations, if somebody said, hey, WWE wants you to come back, and they came to me with an idea, and I felt like the idea was really cool, and it wasn't just a rehash of something that I did 10 years ago or 12 years ago.
Right.
Especially at this stage of my life, I'm 63 years old. Nobody really wants to see me going out there and doing the same thing I did 12 or 15 years ago. But if they came to me with a little different angle, and it felt like something fresh, and I felt like it was something I could really pull off and it would be fun, I would rather do that than put myself in a position of trying to recreate the monster again, because I don't believe it can be done. I think the world has changed so dramatically that it just will never happen. There will never be another Monday Night War opportunity. I think that there could be, an opportunity to build a successful company and build a successful entertainment company or sports entertainment company, professional wrestling, whatever you want to call it, but it will never compete with WWE. It'll never compete with Monday Night Raw. It'll never compete with SmackDown on Fox when it ends up there. That will never happen. So rather than try to attempt something that I know will never happen, I'd rather just go have fun and be a character.
True, but neither does it have to happen either. Obviously, with all the avenues now, it doesn't have to compete with WWE. That part was kind of a stretch on my question. I didn't really mean that part, but I'm very happy to see where you go, because whether you did go back in some temporary type of run, as you mentioned with WWE, that'd be interesting. I wouldn't be surprised with another 3 or 4 or 5 years in your expertise. The Young Bucks or some, a group of wrestlers like that have now learned the possibilities, maybe coming to you for your expertise on a side project that's not meant to necessarily compete, but wants to have you involved. I think that would be an avenue that I think you could find interested in, down the line potentially. And I think that would be awesome for fans to see you and kind of back in the saddle on that side of the business again, as well. But, obviously we didn't think we'd be streaming as easily and as inexpensively as we would have been, or that we are now 10 years ago. So who knows what the cards hold for Eric Bischoff. Hopefully they will bring you back on the show down the line when some new things come out about you and your career. And we really do appreciate you taking as long as you have. We're reaching an hour now. So as always, awesome interview, awesome discussion, Eric, and good luck with 83 weeks that everybody can find and listen to in iTunes, everywhere that you can find podcasts. It is worth your listening ears. So please go check it out. And Eric, once again, man, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it. Good luck to both of you.
All right. Thanks a lot,
Eric. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you soon.
That was Eric Bischoff. This is the Voice of Wrestling. That's Nick Paglino. I'm Chris Cash. We'll see you next week.